Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. Are your firewalls protecting your customers' networks? I'm Sarah Duffy, Marketing Manager here at Barracuda MSP, and I'm happy to be moderating today's panel discussion. In today's joint webinar with Auvik Networks, we will be sharing why NextGen Firewall is necessary for your customers, the differences between new and old firewall technology, the associated network security benefits, and much more. First, I'd like to introduce our panelist. Our first panelist is Mark Valgier. He's a system engineer here at Barracuda MSP. Mark has over 10 years of experience in the information technology field supporting various firewall deployments. And we also have here Ray Patel. He is a product manager at Auvik. Ray has 8 years of experience in the telecom, banking, technology, and SaaS industry, expanding into various industries and domains. Before we get started, let's do some brief housekeeping. Submit your questions in the chat panel to the right of the Zoom webinar screen. Feel free to submit any of your questions throughout the webinar, as today's session is a panel-based presentation, so it's going to be very interactive. This panel discussion will help you better understand the network landscape, how firewalls are changing, and will provide you with suggestions on how to better leverage either the firewalls you're using today or firewalls that you are thinking about implementing and at your client sites. And we will also be responding to your questions in real time. So as you submit your questions in, we will be answering them as they come in. At the conclusion of the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a brief polling survey. Please take a moment to tell us what you think, as we are continuously improving the content and quality of our online events. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our first webinar panelist to begin today's presentation. Mark, take it away.
All right. Thanks a lot, Sarah. Well, I appreciate everyone joining today. First off, we just want to talk about the need for a cloud generation firewall and how that came from the evolution of the modern network. So a constant stream of new applications provide new ways to access information as well as new potential vulnerabilities. So no longer are people only logging in from physically connected devices at corporate offices. Now everyone has laptops, tablets, smartphones that they want to be able to connect to. Software as a service, virtualization, and public cloud offerings create efficient ways of providing information as well as new threat vectors. This results in a new network architecture with a new, more advanced security needs. So in the beginning, a firewall was a very basic on-off device. It would let the IP address be granted access or not, and maybe do a little bit of antivirus scanning, pretty much what a modern-day router can do today. Now, the next evolution of firewalls came into play and widened the scope by taking into account the port where traffic tried to access the network, and then with the next generation firewall, having some real deep visibility into seeing what applications were traversing the network and taking that into account as well. Today, we've actually entered into the era of what we're calling our cloud-ready next-generation firewalls, or cloud-gen firewalls. What this does is add in a lot of things like WAN optimization capabilities, management and scalability from a central location, being able to terminate VPNs from remote locations, and really giving you a lot of reporting features as well as link balancing and traffic intelligence. So overall, what this is doing is this is, in a sense, combining all of the different features and functionalities that may have been required by a separate device and bundling into the cloud generation firewall, so leaving you with a solid endpoint. So you're really going to need the cloud generation firewall to ensure availability of business critical data at any time and from anywhere.
All right. Thanks, Mark. As a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them anytime in the chat panel. As we jump into our panel discussion with Mark and Ray, we do have a few frequently asked questions teed up to begin the conversation. Our first question that we will begin with is a question we hear quite frequently from IT providers, from the Auvik side as well as the Barracuda MSP side. So Ray, I'm going to pass this over to you to start us off here. But how, as we, talk to, MSPs, how can they justify the investment in a firewall upgrade to their clients?
Thanks, Sarah, and it's a great question. Whenever we speak with partners, really we come back to asking, well, what's your client's objective? What type of businesses and verticals is your client within? Are they typically considered a valuable target to rogue actors? Have we built a sort of risk profile internally on if their own employees are vulnerable and prone to phishing attacks, ransomware, any of the current threats and emerging threats that we are seeing? There are tools that allow us to gain answers to these questions, and based on some of the metrics that we do receive, we do recommend typically putting together a sort of security profile and a recipe and a strategy overall to put together a plan on what we're actually going to do from a deployment standpoint. And largely a firewall upgrade is a huge part of that. So there's multiple ways that we guide partners on justifying such an investment. The typical pitch these days is there's a lot more data that is streaming off-prem. Many applications, in many cases, the majority of applications are now being hosted off-prem in the cloud. And that simply means that we have more traffic that's traversing and flowing through the perimeter of the network. We also know that the threat ecosystem itself is evolving, not just day by day, but hour by hour, minute by minute. Having signatures based on snapshots and threats that were captured previously in the past don't cut it these days. Today, we need to look at anomaly detection and other algorithms that are in place to actually see, well, what is manifesting as a threat in real time. And then the other thing to also consider is a firewall obviously takes the brunt from a security standpoint, but there's other things to consider when you have an appliance at the perimeter. There's huge leaps and bounds in performance that one can realize by deploying a NextGen Firewall today. There's improved reliability, not with hardware, but also up-to-date software. And finally, just setting yourself up for a bit of future-proofing with what emerging threats will be coming down the pipe tomorrow as well.
Great. I absolutely agree with all that. I see a lot of the same things from a security perspective as well when talking to customers. And I think you hit it exactly on the head. The attacks are becoming much more advanced. And so that kind of baseline, kind of essentially router-based network segmentation just isn't cutting it these days. And you need to make sure that you're securing yourself and making sure that nothing is getting onto your network that you're not aware of that behavior. So keeping those signature databases updated and making sure you're staying a step ahead of the game to really try to prevent that 0-day, 0-hour type of threat.
So next question that centers around networks are changing, client deployments can vary depending on the industry, if they have legacy systems and so on. Mark, this next question I'll have you start with. One other question we frequently hear from folks is we currently have clients leveraging on-premise and cloud deployments. How can I be confident that we're securing both and not just relying on just one part of the deployment being secure?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things go into this when you're thinking about it. The first thing is that sometimes people have a hesitation to want to deploy in the cloud, in a public cloud or in a virtual cloud. And that's because they're worried about features and functionality matching up, or is it going to be that same level of protection? And so something that Barracuda has done a lot of effort in is to make sure that our features and functionality are uniform across the board. So regardless of if you're deploying in a wiring closet for a client or up in Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, or in your own private cloud, you're going to have that same capability for monitoring and protection as you would anywhere else. And so this is a really nice thing that we focused a lot on to make sure that that experience is the same. As well as, for MSPs, you're constantly going to be having customers thinking, hey, well, I've got this wiring closet now, but down the road, maybe I'd like to move some of my stuff into the cloud and make sure I have that protection there. So that's one piece of it. Again, making sure that you have the capability to meet those customers' needs regardless of where they're deploying. And the other piece is that I think sometimes people don't really think about is that they say, hey, I'm going to put this information in the cloud, and Amazon's just going to a lot of times And Amazon and Microsoft and all your cloud providers are going to provide some level of protection, but what they're really protecting is their infrastructure. And they don't necessarily care about the data that's being stored up there, if that's intellectual property or databases or whatever that might be. And so that's where kind of the onus is on you as the owner of that information to set up some safeguards and protection there. And so they always recommend deploying an additional firewall there specifically for that purpose, because frankly, they don't really care about your information or who gets access to it. They just care about protecting their infrastructure. And so that's really why they're recommending that third party to be in, because it's really focused on that secure access and monitoring and things of that nature. And so it's very important to have a cloud firewall deployed if you're doing anything else in the cloud. And so again, that's why Barracuda really focused on making sure that protection capability was uniform all the way across the board.
Yeah, and Mark, I completely agree with you. And I think I'd want to reiterate a couple of your points there. You mentioned, you can't exclusively rely on a cloud provider's security. They're at the end of the day, their main focus is infrastructure. And while they do provide feature sets like security groups and call it access control to allow traffic to flow to and from a given cluster of VMs or other sorts of infrastructure, that's not what their bread and butter really is. And as a service provider that is deploying critical services for clients in the cloud, it is typically a necessary additional step to take to deploy a purpose-built appliance within the cloud to protect assets that are also living in the cloud. And then finally, when it does come to deploying in cloud versus on-prem, a number of different vendors do provide tools that allow you to migrate your security policies, your configs, and everything else to and from a physical appliance to a virtual appliance. So typically the barrier to entry and the cutover step, if you will, has been minimized in terms of complexity nowadays from a number of different vendors.
So our next question comes from a management perspective, especially when, as an IT service provider, you have multiple clients, multiple networks, multiple firewalls to manage, and you have limited staff to also manage those firewalls and the networks. Ray, I'll begin this question, I'll pass it back to you. Do you have any recommendations on efficient ways or, best practices and tips to manage and to secure, customer networks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a question that we see on a daily basis from a number of our partners, and we try to push and encourage our partner base to follow a set of best practices when it does come to securing their networks and making sure that they're on top of their game when it does come to network management and monitoring. And, a lot of these things sound simple, but when you add them all up together, they do form a solid recipe and a pitch that you can provide to your clients to reassure them that you're keeping on top of keeping an eye on those networks. And it can be something as simple as staying up to date on firmware. We typically see a lot of partners onboarding gear that is several years out of date. And one of the first steps that they see upon having their devices onboarded and reported on is that they see that there are several firmware versions behind. That leads to a number of security vulnerabilities. That leads to a number of features that they aren't currently leveraging that have been published in more recent firmware updates. So that simple step, as well as things like not using default passwords, it's still alarming how many network devices are using default passwords for Telnet, SSH, your web GUI, that these are typically the first things that a number of people will see when onboarding devices into Auvik, as an example. And we flag that and help people actually take action to get that stuff corrected. The other thing I'd say is really know your network. And there's a few kind of key things that I'd encourage and suggest on that front. Documentation, it is a daily struggle for many partners. I used to work in a couple large Canadian ISPs, and I semi-fondly remember the days of mapping up Visio diagrams and seeing them in shared folders and going stale after months. Diagrams and documentation, they are a necessary task, and that's something we certainly help with. Things like topology mapping, knowing definitive port-to-port connections between devices, as well as collecting stats and data on key KPIs on network infrastructure. So your CPU, your memory, the interface utilization on not just your internet link, but LAN links that are also connecting vital parts of the business together. And then finally, using that data to actually extrapolate and figure out things like capacity planning. Am I projected to potentially run out of bandwidth over the next few weeks or months as I'm onboarding new employees or adding additional applications for their daily use to do their job? I'd also look at things like mitigating risk when it comes to failure modes. So if a box does fail, do I have backups of those configs? Are they recent? Are they in a format which I can quickly restore back onto a device when I do need to roll a truck quickly and cut over an emergency box? And also setting up a tool or having some workflows to have alerts that ensure that your gear is actually adhering to some of these best practices. And when they aren't, being able to plumb that into your specific workflow like a PSA, and being able to be proactive as much as you possibly can. Mark, any thoughts?
Yeah, Ray, I absolutely agree with everything you said. I think, it does take quite a bit of heavy lifting at the start, but being sure to kind of define what we call a security policy. So understanding, hey, like you mentioned, we've got to keep all of our firmware up to date to a certain revision, or what's the timing for this? And really defining what you're wanting to protect and how you're going to protect it. That way everyone is on the same page of how things need to be done, and it really, over the long run, makes things a lot easier to manage. Unfortunately, I've been involved in some situations where a network was just kind of built out piece by piece, and then something went wrong, and it was essentially catastrophic to the client because they weren't able to track down really how it happened for a long period of time, and then it just kind of proliferated around the network, and so it just really made for a challenging situation for them. But being able to set up this security policy early on, get that definition, make sure everyone is aware of it, is really key, I think, to long-term success, and making things easier to manage for everyone in the long term.
Great, thanks. Those are a lot of great practices you guys have to recommend. So our last frequently asked question before we open it up to the audience here to submit their questions. I do see some questions coming in here, and we're looking forward to answering those in just a few minutes. But our last question that we have here before we open it up to everyone is somewhat similar to our previous question about management. So Ray, I'll have you, start off with this again. So what are the benefits from using security automation and centralized management? What are the increased costs? It's always, a big concern of, how much more am I going to have to pay either staff or, a vendor, from a business perspective, how is it going to affect my business?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Great question as well. I've really looked at this largely from it's a short-term pain, long-term gain sort of proposition. Security automation, centralized management, these are products, these are tools. They do obviously come with an initial increase in cost here. But I typically look at that as an investment that will help me accomplish a few things. It'll help me prevent knowledge silos. We have, in a typical MSP, you'll have one or two network guys or subject matter experts there. You'll also have a number of technicians that are more endpoint focused on servers and workstations, as an example. And the knowledge that those one or two technicians do have that lives typically in their head can potentially be a risk to the business for multiple reasons. So the ability to offload some of that knowledge and have it live inside a tool set that allows for centralized management does allow the team to grow, as well as prevent some of the risks that do come with those knowledge silos. I'd also state that it helps us accomplish the goal of consistency. And what I mean by that is less deviation in configurations that I have across my different customer base. Mark previously mentioned defining a sort of security recipe, if you will, and I'd kind of extend that out to include the network as well. So when I typically am deploying for a client of a specific size, I might want to deploy firewall X, switch Y, and Wi-Fi infrastructure Z. And from that, I typically want to make sure that my configs are in a standardized format that allow me as a service desk manager or a technician to know that I know what I'm really looking at. I don't need to spend valuable minutes when I am troubleshooting an issue to kind of reverse engineer the configs that have been left behind. And any deviations that I do see from my consistent templates might actually pose as a security risk, and I should investigate why those deviations do exist in the first place. And then I think finally what I'd state is agility. Having something standardized and housed in a single repository can allow me as a business to do more prospecting, onboard new clients more quickly, and ultimately lead to closing more deals over a period of time. So it allows me to grow my business without having to grow necessarily my staff at a larger rate, and it allows me to do all of my or much of my onboarding stuff much more quickly.
Yep, absolutely, Ray. I couldn't agree more. I think you really hit it with the template piece. I mean, the more things you can standardize on, the easier everything's going to be, and that transfer of knowledge. If a new technician comes on, or roles shift around, something like that, makes things so much easier. From the Barracuda side specifically, we have some nice capabilities specifically around that. Being able to save what we call like a PAR file, which is a configuration file, and then have that as like a baseline. So when you need to redeploy to another client, again, it can be done very, very quickly because that's already saved, and then you're just needing to make some simple tweaks, depending on what their network looks like. So, as long as you can standardize things, it's going to make your life easier. So, yeah, absolutely agree with you there, Ray. And Barracuda works really hard to make it as simple as possible to be versatile.
Now we will be opening it up to our audience. So if you have any questions, you can submit them in the chat panel to the right of the Zoom webinar screen. We do have a few questions here from the audience. Our first question here is, can I get a recording of this webinar? Yes, you can. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be sent out within 24 hours or so. So we'll make sure everyone that attended here will receive the recording. All right, so our first question here. Mark, you stated at the beginning of the presentation about how the firewalls have been changing over time. Do you see any future landscape changes for firewalls from changing as well?
Absolutely. As the technology advances, you're always going to want to be able to try to stay a step ahead of a new type of attack. So that's going to be very consistent. I think as we see now, the big push is moving things to the cloud, and so ensuring that we have the protection there. But as new technologies arise and they become more available or more prevalent, we're constantly going to be working to provide that protection or provide that technology. The interesting thing about security is that there's kind of a set of white hats and a set of black hats, and they're just kind of going back and forth. So I release a new attack as a black hat. I'm going to release a new patch or solution or fix as a white hat. And so that's just how that perpetually evolves. There's never really any stagnation because, some people unfortunately just like to watch the world burn. I can't count the number of articles I've read where it's like someone says they cracked something. And it's like, well, it's great you did that. I mean, I don't see why you did that, but you just opened up the world to another set of vulnerabilities that now get to be patched. And so, different people have different mentalities on that. I think ultimately it's good. We want to be as secure as possible. And so the more things that we find vulnerabilities in, the more things we can protect everyone from. But yeah, absolutely, that landscape is constantly going to be changing, which is why it's very important to stay current with your updates, stay current with your firmware. It's not really like a router where you can say, oh, well, this is what my network looks like, and I'll set it up and configure it and see you later. You need to make sure that those updates are getting through. And a lot of it can be automated, so it's a very simple process, but it's just a matter of getting it set up. So making sure it's consistent and you're in line with your security policy and the needs of your business.
So the next question we have here, I'll give it to you, Ray. where do you see the next threats coming from, that we should protect our networks from?
I'd say it's a combination of outside, but I'd say also, unfortunately, a lot of the threats that we're seeing increasingly come from within. It's the standard case of I found a flash drive on the way into the office in the parking lot, plugged it in out of curiosity, and that flash drive did contain some malicious code that is now wreaking havoc amongst my peers' workstations and potentially accessing some confidential data. So I'd say it's kind of a two-pronged threat that members of IT staff are now kind of posed with. And there's an increasing focus, I can speak for the network side in particular, where MSPs are trying to figure out how to lock things down internally so that, for example, switch ports that are currently empty cannot be plugged into without being administratively turned on. Turning on things like PortFast, BDPU, preventing any potential loops that could be caused maliciously or otherwise, and ensuring that, again, threats that are intentioned or accidental are not potentially opening up new holes or vulnerabilities elsewhere within the network stack.
So we have a question here, Mark.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Did you have something else to add to Ray's comment?
Oh, no, I was just going to agree. I think he kind of hit on it, but really it's the human firewall that's kind of the weakest link. So being able to make sure that, doing exactly that, no one's trying to plug in their own wireless router in the middle of the office to create a vulnerability there, or like I said, grab that USB. Just really educating your employees and clients to understand what these threats are. And I think that's the real big piece of the battle, because you could have the most advanced antivirus out there, but if someone goes to a place and clicks a link or plugs in that USB, there's not much you can do about it. So education is a big piece of, I think. Absolutely right, Ray.
Great point. Right. The next question here, Mark, I'll give this to you. We have a question here that says, we see a lot of traffic from countries like China, et cetera. How much load does it put if we define a rule to stop certain countries, to stop scan, et cetera?
No, great question. So we use technology called geolocation for the purposes of filtering, or geo-blocking, as some people like to call it. Actually, it would be less. It would be fewer things to scan. So if you wanted to completely block a region, like you said, like China, if there was no reason for your client to be receiving traffic from China, you can essentially create a rule that blocks all of those IPs associated with it, and then that'll prevent those attacks from coming in. And then, of course, if you needed exceptions to that, you could always add in different trusted URLs, but it actually makes it really easy to prevent all those traffic streams from coming through with a simple rule based upon that location. And we can do it by country or region. You can get very granular into what you're looking to protect with. So it'll actually, in the grand scheme of things, having a rule there like that would save you some cycles, because you wouldn't have to do full scans on traffic that you weren't familiar with if you knew already that it didn't need to be there.
The next question we have here is another technology-based question about WAF technology. How do you see WAF technology affecting traditional firewalls?
So I think it's a absolutely crucial technology if you are hosting web applications or web servers. It's really nice because they kind of work hand in hand. So you're still going to absolutely need an edge firewall or a traditional network firewall, whatever you'd like to call it, because that's protecting your network access and doing some of like the heavy lifting for the filtering. The web application firewall is really designed to protect those web applications and websites from attacks like scripting. So attacks like that come through, they just look like a text query. And so the traditional firewall, in most cases, they can usually stop some of the basic well-known ones, but it's not going to have that cycle to do that really granular lookup of that web traffic that's coming through. And so the web application firewall is really going to act as an intermediary, protecting your servers from any of these malicious kind of scripting attacks coming through there. Another thing that it can do is ensure that everything is traveling over and HTTPS secure connection, so that if someone comes in and types HTTP, that server's going to respond, or that user's going to get a response from the server in HTTPS. So a lot of really useful things it can do to really help protect your server infrastructure. Unfortunately, servers are very, very nice. They want to help everyone out, and so if someone asks them a question, they try to get back to them. But attackers do a lot of malicious things with that, like trying to overload it, or trying to get things to time out, or just trying to pull information from places that they shouldn't. And so the web application firewall is critical for protecting these types of attacks and protecting your web server environment. So like I said, they work hand in hand. You still need that cloud generation firewall at your network edge, but the web application firewall is really going to protect your web services specifically.
Great. Next question we have here. I'll give this to you, Ray. The question is, I don't have time to manage my firewalls. The firewalls I have in place are fine. Do you have any best practices or recommendations of managing them going forward?
Yeah, in such a case, I'd say it would make a lot of fiscal sense up front to then look at an appliance that can update itself in real time. And I think that would be a great example of investing in an NGF to ensure that I am looking at all the different threat vectors and getting updates for all these different types of attacks, as opposed to call it a more traditional firewall, which is rule-based, that is relying on signature-based detection and requires a bit more manual maintenance of rules. It would allow you to free up a bit of time once you set up reporting and every other ways to keep an eye on it. You can take a slightly more, I use the term loosely, passive approach to keeping on what is going on at the perimeter, knowing that you do have something automated that is updating itself in real time to protect you from the call it the latest and greatest threats, if you will. Mark, I don't know if you have anything to add to that one.
No, absolutely. I think that getting started early and keeping stuff updated is going to be key there. Mm-hmm.
Another question we have here is, I'm having failover issues. Do you offer failover or WANs or IP? Do you offer failover to 4G? What type of failover can you offer for me?
Yep, absolutely. So the Barracuda firewall does a lot of really cool stuff with the failover. So just to address that last piece, we absolutely have a capability for an LTE modem that you can attach via USB to fail over that way through a wireless WAN. Obviously, those connection speeds are probably going to be a little bit slower than what you're used to with your ISP, but that's definitely an option for say like a remote location or kind of a spotty service situation. So that's definitely one option. The other option is we actually can do we have what's called traffic intelligence. So we can do if you have multiple links, you can fail over your traffic also one link if the other one fails. And what's really nice, we've done something really great with this that has potential savings over your link costs instead of having to buy that really expensive super reliable link. You're able to basically say, all right, I've got two kind of cable providers that are going to be providing my internet, but I'm paying for both of them. So why don't I run my business critical traffic through this one that's maybe a little more bandwidth, maybe a little better SLA, and then I run all of my my YouTube and my social media over this other link. You're able to still be using both of those links for bandwidth. You're paying for them. You don't have to worry about social media taking up that business critical bandwidth. But in the situation that one of those links does fail, we can dynamically fail everything over to the other remaining link, and then dynamically adjust the quality of service. So now this business critical traffic is always getting top priority, and that YouTube and Facebook and whatever else that might be there is no longer getting that priority. And so you're maintaining that business continuity and making sure that you're staying up constantly with those two links that you're saving. So like I said, some real cost savings are there by utilizing this technology versus having some very, very expensive maybe some dark fiber links or whatever might be out there available to you to have that level of reliability. So some great cost savings there, as well as failover capability.
Thanks, Mark. We have another question here, Ray. Someone has submitted a question asking, what can Auvik do to help with my firewall deployment? Because they're not really familiar with Auvik.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Auvik can help on a few fronts there when it comes to deploying and managing firewalls. I think I'd kind of tie it back to some of the theme of centralized management, building out a configuration template, and especially when you're going into, say, a new prospect that has an existing deployment, it's also useful to understand, well, what's the current state of the network? And where we can really help with that is doing a automated discovery of a device that has been deployed. The onboarding step within Auvik that needs to be taken is twofold. The first is deploying a collector that can be spun up as a virtual appliance or as a Windows executable on, say, a domain controller. And either of those collectors can then use protocols like SNMP, use the CLI, so SSH or Telnet, and optionally, with some vendors as well, we can leverage some REST APIs that might be exposed. And then from there, we can build up an understanding of, well, what type of device is this? What's its configuration look like? And as you actually let that collector kind of soak and start to collect some stats over the course of weeks, days, months even, we can start building up some trending history to understand, well, are we seeing some weird spikes in traffic at 2 a.m? Are we seeing some weird spikes of traffic happen from the segment of the network that is typically, say, IoT traffic that is in the tens of kilobits, but over the last couple of weeks, I've seen surges up to 10 megs, just as an example. So where we can really help is kind of centralizing and unifying the view that you might see with your firewall amongst other critical network infrastructure like your switches, your Wi-Fi, optionally a router if you have that as well, and see that end-to-end experience. And if you optionally also scanned endpoints like workstations and servers, you can then get an end-to-end view even across different sites to say, well, if server A, which is in site A, wants to talk to server B that is in site B, well, what's the logical network path that's being taken? So this is beyond a simple trace route at layer 3, but I can actually traverse layer 1 and understand, well, what specific ports am I looking at? Am I traversing a specific or a set of layer 2 segments that packet might be taking? So a number of different ways that we can actually pivot a lot of this data that is being collected and presented in different representations. It's fully exportable. You can also collect inventory and sync it to a PSA of choice as well. So we offer a number of integrations on that front. And if you'd love to learn more, we're happy to give you a quick demo as well at some future point.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank both Mark and Ray for sharing a lot of great information today. We have just launched a poll. If you just take a few moments to submit your answer, that would be greatly appreciated. I do want to quickly share a promotion from Auvik for today's webinar attendees. If you schedule a demo at auvik.com/nextgen, you can submit your information to complete a demo that Ray was just mentioning there to learn more about Auvik itself and how it could potentially help your MSP. And in doing so, you're also eligible for a nice little Starbucks gift card as well. So again, that's auvik.com/nextgen. And then lastly, if you're interested in learning about our CloudGen firewalls from Barracuda MSP, you can visit us at barracudamsp.com/firewall. And I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us for today's great webinar session. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Mark. I thought this was a great conversation, and I hope a lot of folks got a lot of great value out of this. And we'll see
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks everyone.
Sarah.